Hello and good morning. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and this is Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine and a good friend of the show, Dr. Jennifer Kavanagh, who is a military analyst for defense priorities. Previously, she worked for the RAND Corporation and the Carnegie Endowment, and in the last few years has really established herself as a meticulous researcher whose analysis is driven by that research and hard facts and not the other way around. This has led her to some unpopular conclusions in the Beltway establishment on the Ukraine war, the U.S. force posture in Europe, and its waning capabilities in the Middle East due to funding and arming ongoing wars in Ukraine and on Israel's behalf, not to mention the current war in Iran. So we're going to talk to her about, we'll try to talk to her about all of it. Thank you, Jen, for coming on the show again.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. This is a bit of a crazy day. Lots of headlines bouncing. Today is also the so-called deadline for Iran to open up the Strait of Hormuz. By now, everyone has seen Trump's profanity-laden Truth Social post demanding that the bastards open up. But then there is this Truth Social, which was posted by President Trump this morning. Chris, I think we have that on a full screen. Yeah, so a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, Trump says, but it probably will. However, now that we have complete and total regime change, where different, smarter, and less radicalized minds prevail, something revolutionary might happen. Who knows? A lot of people are squirming this morning, Jen, particularly after Mark Levin subtly, not so subtly, suggested maybe the nuclear option to end this war on his radio show last night. This was called out by Tucker Carlson, but there seems to be more talk about the nuclear option. Also, Chris mentioned to me that J.D. Vance, who is in Hungary today to support Viktor Orban, also mentioned that Trump has other tools in his toolbox. Jen, what do you make of the Truth Social post, the threats, this looming deadline on the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to read this. The more calm way to read it maybe is to read this as just President Trump being himself. We know that he likes to make these exaggerated threats and pronouncements on social media. It's part of what he calls the art of the deal. He never wants to take any options off the table. He thinks this unpredictability and irrationality in some cases makes him a stronger negotiator and gives him leverage. So we can read it that way, or we can read it the other way, which I think is more worrying, which is that this actually is a statement of a change in the type of warfare that the United States might use if Iran doesn't agree to a deal today, which I think is pretty unlikely. And that, could be nuclear weapons. It could be, increased volume of strikes. It could be more use of more powerful bombs. It could be a different type of target. But I think that, but that to me is very concerning. I've been worried about the president escalating for some time because I think he's frustrated and is at a point where either needs to walk away or escalate. And after the successful rescue of the airmen over the weekend, I was concerned that this would embolden him, and that does seem to be the direction that he's moving.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that rescue. You know, Trump had a press conference yesterday with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, along with Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane, where they did a sort of play-by-play on the rescue operations. Chris, let's go to cut 2.
Look, in a certain sense, we've already won because we've knocked out their Navy, we've knocked out their Air Force, and we knocked out all of their communications, their telecommunications, and very importantly, we knocked out their anti-aircraft apparatus.
We are systematically dismantling the regime's ability to threaten America or project power outside of their borders. They have no anti-aircraft equipment. Their radar is 100% annihilated. We are unstoppable as a military force, and the country has been eviscerated and essentially is really no longer a threat.
The upcoming days will be decisive. Iran knows that, and there's almost nothing they can militarily do about it.
Sorry about that, Chris. I know I said cut to. I wanted to get right to the press conference where there did seem to be some effort to spin what had happened, which was really the shoot down of this F-15 plane on Friday. They recovered the first pilot, and then there was this daring operation to extricate the other airmen out of there on Sunday. It seemed there was this sense of, because we were able to engage this operation, it was dangerous, exciting, daring, historical, that somehow this proved that Iran was impotent and losing the war. Jen, can you talk a little bit about what the shoot down, the operation to extricate, the spin, how does this change any of the military or strategic dynamic in terms of what the U.S. military thinks it may be able to accomplish or not now with Iran?
Well, in a big picture sense, I don't think it has really significant operational implications, but I do think it pulls out a couple of important things. The first is this idea that Iran has no weapons is clearly wrong. The United States does have dominance over Iran's skies, but that doesn't mean no risk. It doesn't mean that Iran doesn't have any more defenses. And their ability to shoot down the F-15 as well as the A-10 that was shot down on the same day really does show that Iran can still impose costs on the United States. And maybe there was a little bit of overconfidence from the United States in terms of what it could accomplish right directly over Iran's territory. And so I think this is a reminder of that. Trying to spin the rescue as a success, I mean, yes, it was daring, and I'm very thankful that both the pilot and the weapons officer are out of Iran safely. But we should really see this as a disaster that averted a worse disaster. Of course, it would have been a big propaganda coup for Iran to take one of those two military officers alive. And it's really great that was avoided. That would have been strategically complicated for the United States. It would have given Iran leverage. But the United States still lost multiple aircraft and was in this situation because an aircraft was shot down. So this is not an operational success. The military managed to cauterize the wound and prevent a worse disaster, and did show its tactical excellence in executing a very difficult raid and extraction operation. But it came at a high military cost. I'm not suggesting that cost shouldn't have been paid. It should be paid. The U.S. military doesn't leave soldiers behind, and that's an important principle that it abides by. But we should acknowledge that this was a very costly operation. I think the final thing it suggests is this extraction was pretty short. It was a limited duration operation. And this idea that the United States could operate on the ground, whether it's a special forces raid or something else, for a longer period of time doing something more complex, given all of the challenges that were encountered in this short duration operation, to me, it suggests absolutely this would be a disaster, any other type of more complicated operation. I don't know if that's how the president sees it, but that's certainly how I interpret it.
Well, this is what's got me concerned. Everything you just said in terms of the implications of that, the shoot down, the extrication, the fact that they were under fire the entire time, the implications on this idea that we might be sending ground troops in, whether it be to take over Karg or the other islands around Hormuz. We've been talking about it for a few weeks now. We also know that military analysts across the spectrum say this would be a disaster. My concern is that Trump has gotten the message on that, and that is why he is talking about another tool in his toolbox, or at least hinting that that other tool might be like the nuclear option, going beyond the air campaign that we have been waging on Iran for weeks. What do you think about that?
I do think that the president wants to put an exclamation point on this campaign. He clearly wants an off ramp, but he can't find one with conventional means. He hasn't found one through diplomacy, and he clearly wants an exclamation point and some kind of big win that he can use to sell this war as a success. And for that reason, I can't rule out that there would be some kind of escalation into the nuclear domain. As much as it pains me to say that, and as much as I'm hoping that I'm wrong. Um, I guess I think it's more likely that that exclamation point comes through some kind of fantastic conventional operation. But I don't know what that looks like if we're talking only about air strikes or ground strikes from afar. And any sort of ground operation, as you suggested, would be a catastrophic failure. So if we're really looking here for an exclamation point, it's possible that they see this nuclear option as something that, or as the only option. And I mean, it might not be like a strategic nuclear weapon, right? We might not be talking about like another Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We might be talking about sort of low yield tactical nukes, but that would still break a significant norm. And like, I'm not big on norms and their power, but since World War II, nuclear weapons haven't been used, and breaking that barrier and doing that would open the door for all sorts of proliferation and use of these weapons in other contexts, I think.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit more about the campaign of the last 4 or so weeks. You wrote a riveting piece for Responsible Statecraft that got a lot of attention, deservedly, about how Iranians were damaging or destroying altogether U.S. radars and sensors in the region, and why there have been so many direct hits on Israel and our Gulf partners before their missile defense systems could detect and destroy incoming. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you've done on those sensors and radars, and what kind of impact that is happening on the success or lack thereof of our campaign so far?
Sure. So, I think the puzzle that I started with was this question of why so many missiles are getting through Israel's and U.S. air defenses. And it's not just drones. We know that there's a gap here in counter drone capabilities. So that could be explained simply by the lack of, drone defenses. But it's also missiles getting through. And it's certainly the case that diminishing stockpiles means that both Israel and the United States and Gulf partners are having to choose between targets and maybe use fewer munitions for interception. So that could explain part of it. But what it doesn't explain is these successful strikes at places like Dimona or this attack on the U.S. E-3 aircraft. If there was anything that the United States and Israel would defend, it's these types of high-value targets. And so the fact that we're seeing successful strikes on these targets suggests to me that it's not just about munition stockpiles. And so then the question is, well, what is it? It's also not fully explained by Iran's new weapons or some kind of new tactic that it's using. And so the only thing left really is that it's a problem not of interception, but of detection. And when you look at the bigger picture, we know that the United States has suffered the loss of significant sensor and radar capabilities across the region, and we don't even know the extent of it. We know that something like 10 or maybe a dozen radars have been hit and damaged. But now satellite companies aren't even providing the images of U.S. bases in the region. So we don't even know now how bad the damage is. And so the loss of those radars isn't going to make it impossible for the United States to intercept or conduct air defense operations, because we have resiliency in that area. We have lots of sensors, we have lots of radars, we have lots of types of radars, we have satellite data that we collect and use for that. But it will degrade the ability, which means that the detection may be less good, or we may miss things. And this affects not just the U.S. and its bases and its ability to protect U.S. forces and assets, but it also affects Israel, because Israel relies on U.S. Like an integrated network with the United States. And it also affects the U.S. ability to use air power because those radars are also used to detect threats to aircraft. fact that there was the shoot down of the F-15 also was maybe a piece of this puzzle, that the damage to U.S. radar and sensor capabilities, both in terms of early warning for air operations and the interception of Iranian missiles, may be significantly degraded. And this obviously has implications for the safety of our forces now in the Middle East, but it also has even bigger implications for U.S. air defense operations in a future war, say in Asia. Because if our air defenses can't stand up to Iranian attacks, they certainly aren't going to be robust in the Asia Pacific context against China.
That is such a good point, Jen. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, we had Jim Webb on the show last week, and he talked about how they've been wargaming this U.S. Iranian conflict for some time. He spoke of one major game that took place like 20 years ago. And it was catastrophic in terms of like sending in troops and the Strait of Hormuz and the shutdown of shipping. This is all anticipated. Can you talk about whether or not like this idea that our radars and sensors would be so vulnerable, was that ever part of the equation? Like, we have such an integrated system with Israel and our Gulf partners. We talk about that network of integration all of the time. Like, did we not see that this might happen, or did we underestimate Iran's capability? Were we listening to bad intelligence from Israel that convinced us that they were so weak that this might never happen?
I think it's a number of things. I definitely think Iran's military capabilities were underestimated. This type of problem was something that people talked about in an Asia context, but not so much in the Middle East. I don't think that there was the expectation that Iran would have the targeting capabilities to hit so many radars successfully. I think drones do play a role, even though it's not only about drones. The ability of Iran to use drones to swarm and confuse air defenses is part of the problem. It makes radars more vulnerable. In the sense that, they can swarm with drones and then missiles get through. This is something we've seen in Ukraine as well. So that's part of the problem. And I think, the realities of warfare are often different than what we see in war games. So even if we war gamed it and expected some damage, it's not surprising that the damage is more extensive than was expected. I mean, I think we should be careful about thinking that war games are like predictive of what will happen. They kind of identify problems and flaws and trends, but they often like miss key pieces. So I think kind of all of those things together. But to me, the sort of biggest gap was this assumption that, especially by the administration, I think that Iran would collapse after a day or two. Like it's clear to me that they thought this war would be over after 3 days or so. And second, just their ability to target effectively. And they have gotten help probably from Russia and China in terms of intelligence, but that also should have been expected because the United States is doing the same thing for Ukraine against Russia.
You mentioned that the satellite companies are not sending us the full images of the damage that has been wrought on the ground, particularly at our bases. Can you go into that a little bit? Because I have seen, I think there was a piece by Drop Site or The Intercept regarding this. Can you talk a little bit about what we're not seeing?
Well, we're not getting real-time satellite data like we usually do. These satellite companies are withholding the real-time information. And if they are providing information at all, it's kind of at a higher level of resolution, so it's harder to see like what the specific damage is. And this is at the request of the U.S. government. So it means that we can't see what the damage looks like now. And in the future, if we get the data, let's say in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it may be sanitized in ways that prevent us from seeing some of the details. Now, that doesn't mean that we're operating totally blind here. Non-U.S. satellite companies are still providing this information, so we can still get it, but it's just not quite as good. And so we're left operating sort of with partial information. Now, there was also interesting information here that the Chinese satellite companies are actually collecting this data and sharing it with the Iranians. So we do know that it's out there, which is how we know that the damage is more extensive than the U.S. government has told us.
And what's really frustrating about that is when the Iranians put out these images, it's used in propaganda purposes, and so it's harder for Western audiences to trust and believe in what they're seeing because it's coming vis-a-vis China and then Iran. It would be much better if, like, our government was straight with us about what is going on. I just want to have one last question on the base and destruction issue. We had a piece by Sahar Khan the other day at Responsible Statecraft that talked about the network of U.S. bases in the Gulf and how they were not designed or capable for the kind of asymmetrical warfare that Iran is waging right now. We have tens of thousands of people on that base normally. Many of them have been sent elsewhere for their own safety. As you've mentioned, there's been enormous amounts of impact from Iranian missiles and drones. What is the future of these bases? Are these Gulf partners just going to turn around and say, listen, we thought they were there for our protection. They really weren't. We're going to rethink this huge footprint. Maybe we'll buy some of your missiles and your aircraft, but are these bases even necessary, or are they actually putting a target on our back? What are your thoughts on the future of U.S. bases in the region?
Well, from the U.S. perspective, I've been arguing for a long time that we shouldn't have them there, that they should be closed and the U.S. forces should come home. After the June 2025 Midnight Hammer operation, Dan Caldwell and I wrote several pieces where we argued that these bases in the region, they weren't used for the operations, and they became vulnerable targets when Iran wanted to retaliate, and that these bases in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere should be closed. And several of those bases have been hit with significant damage and U.S. casualties since then. So this is not a new thing or a new revelation. Certainly, this war has underscored even more that these bases aren't that useful. When a conflict in the region happens, we can't use them, either because the countries themselves say that we can't, or because they're so vulnerable that they're just not survivable. The forces can't stay there. And then when Iran retaliates, they're just targets. So, in my view, this war really underscores that having this big footprint forward in the Middle East isn't helpful, and you could make that extension to other regions as well. It also doesn't make the U.S. safer, right? Like the underlying problem here is that Iran was never a real threat to the United States in the first place. We didn't need those bases, and now we have this problem where the bases are there and they're under threat. Now, from the Gulf partners' perspective, the calculation may look a little different. And I think there's two kind of ways to read this. One is absolutely, I think the Gulf partners are disappointed at the amount of U.S. support they've gotten and the amount of protection they've gotten. They, especially countries like Bahrain and Qatar, thought they had these security deals with the United States that turned out to be not that useful. The U.S. has backfilled Israel's air defenses and supported Israel's air defense, but not theirs. On the other hand, it's not clear what other options they have. Like, certainly after this war is over, they will try to build more self-sufficiency and maybe diversify their partnerships. But can they look to China as a security provider? Can they look to Russia as a security provider? No. So they're still going to be dependent on the United States, at least for some period of time. So I do think what happens to these bases will depend less on Gulf partners saying, like, we don't need these anymore, go home, and really rely on U.S. policymakers to finally own up to the fact that these bases are not in U.S. interests and should be closed, and the forces should be sent home or the force structure cut.
Yeah, absolutely. I just can't, I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around how radically the conversation has shifted since this war began. Because for years, we've been told about this, like I said, this network of integrated militaries in the Gulf and the US and Israel, and they were isolating Iran. And that was the goal. I think even in the national security strategy, there was this sense that Iran was the adversary that the rest of us had to sort of isolate and contain. And every time the secretaries of defense and their underlings would go in front of Congress, they would talk about this magical union and how effective it was. And we're seeing all of that sort of fritter away in real time. And I would have never anticipated it. Let's talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. Now, you've done a ton of work. We're going to talk in a second about your new foreign affairs article. But I mean, can you give us a sense of the impact of what's happening in Iran with this ongoing attempt to forge some sort of peace agreement in Ukraine? Is it effectively killed?
Well, it's certainly on hold for an extended period. I mean, we've seen no further trilateral negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States since this war started, and that those were the most productive formats. Having negotiations between the U.S. and Ukraine, or Europe, U.S. and Ukraine, like those are basically useless. It's just negotiating with ourselves. So these trilateral negotiations were really, my only hope for progress towards any kind of settlement, and that stopped. And I think one reason that it stopped is that the U.S. is distracted and doesn't have the bandwidth. But there are other problems here. We can talk first about the implications for Ukraine. Ukraine still depends on the United States for weapons, especially air defense, and it's not going to get any more in the near future. And I think Zelensky is starting to recognize that. The Pearl program is still in operation in theory, but it's not clear that there's any Patriot missiles or, many other types of munitions to really buy, because the priority now for the United States is its own forces in the Middle East, refilling U.S. stockpiles, supporting Israel, and maybe supporting Gulf partners. Ukraine is pretty far down the list. So that leaves Ukraine's industrial infrastructure really vulnerable. And that has been the Russian strategy since the war in Iran started, is to go after Ukraine's manufacturing and economic capability, and that undermines Ukraine's economy, its ability to generate revenue, and it undermines its defense industrial base and its ability to continue to supply itself with military capabilities. And so that will have an impact over the medium term on Ukraine's ability to sustain its frontline activity at the same time as Russia is trying to build a new offensive now that winter's over. On the Russian side, obviously, this has some, at least short-term, advantages. Number one, the U.S. is distracted. Number two, it benefits from Ukraine's lack of air defense. And number three, it's benefited economically. Its economy was really starting to sputter and struggle, and now it has a new windfall. Oil prices are up, and U.S. has lifted sanctions. Now, Ukraine has been actually quite effective recently in sort of long-range drone strikes on Russia's oil production and their ability to export, which has limited Russia's economic benefits. But there's no doubt that Russia has benefited economically from this, and that gives it more flexibility in terms of maintaining its military activity, and maybe diplomacy seems less interesting. And the final point, which I think is really important, is that the same negotiators who failed to get a deal with Iran and instead chose war while negotiations were ongoing. And there's questions about how much, Witkoff and Kushner even understood of the nuclear negotiations with Iran. These were the same negotiators that are in charge of delivering a peace deal on Ukraine. And so I think there are real questions inside of Moscow and in Kyiv about whether or not this is actually a viable diplomatic path. Can Witkoff and Kushner, as the leaders of the U.S. side, actually deliver a deal that lasts? And I think that question is really impeding further progress.
You mentioned Ukraine's battlefield situation, and I just wanted to remind, and we have a cut here from David Petraeus, that there are still a number of people here in Washington who are committed to keeping this war going and are trying to persuade us to think that while we've been looking in one direction, a lot of good things have been happening for Ukraine in another. Want to roll that cut, Chris?
Well, I think what's remarkable is that Russia no longer has the upper hand. Russia heavily outnumbers Ukraine. It outguns Ukraine. It has an economy 10 or 12 times the size of Ukraine's. And yet the Ukrainian forces right now are stopping the Russians cold on the front lines. Yes, there's still glide bombs, there's still drones every night. And in fact, there were 400 drones just today with dozens of missiles. But on the front lines, which is all important, the Russians have actually achieved less than the Ukrainians have in the last 2 weeks.
Does this matter at all, Jen?
Well, I mean, first of all, every time I see David Petraeus put up there as an expert, I just wonder why we still listen to him. So,
I
again,
just
that is,
wanted to make you angry this morning.
I mean, he did this for me before. I just don't know why we're listening to this guy. Okay, but let's engaging more seriously with his points. First of all, I disagree that, I do think that Russia has the upper hand, and I don't disagree that that Ukraine has been successful at sort of freezing the front lines to an extent. Now we'll see if that holds up now that winter is over. But Ukraine isn't gaining territory at a rapid rate. This idea that they've seized a lot of territory, it's more they've cleared out infiltrators from areas where the front line was more mixed. But I disagree that the battlefield, this front line, is all important. What's really important is what's happening behind the front lines, in my view, and that's where Russia has the upper hand. Because it's even if the front line is stalled, if Russia can degrade Ukraine's economic and defense industrial base capabilities enough, it will slowly squeeze Ukraine's ability to continue fighting, and it will make any sort of recovery effort after the war really difficult. So it will leave whatever's remains when a deal is eventually struck that much weaker. So I don't see this as Ukraine having an upper hand or Ukraine winning. It's more that the front line is stalled, but Russia has significant advantages where it matters, which is in this ability to take out Ukraine's economic infrastructure, which will ultimately impose significant costs on Ukraine and weaken it when negotiations resume.
Well, let's talk a little bit about negotiations before we close. I would be remiss not to mention your excellent piece with Sam Charap in Foreign Affairs today called A Flawed Formula for Peace in Ukraine. So you're talking specifically about the mechanics of a peace deal, and you say the administration is right to seek a negotiated end to the fighting, yet structuring a peace agreement around land for security guarantees has not worked yet and is unlikely to work in the future. This approach exaggerates the significance of territory for Russia and the importance of Western assurances for Ukraine, and it neglects to address the key challenge in ending any war, which is what political scientists call the credible commitment problem, convincing a belligerent that its enemy will really commit to peace. So, in a situation in which the administration gets its act together and they pursue an agreement, it sounds like what you're saying that the agreement on the table is oversimplified and will not get them to where they want to go because of such.
Yeah, I mean, the basic problem I see is that trading territory for security guarantees doesn't actually satisfy Ukraine or Russia. Territory is something that will have to be addressed. So I'm not saying that and Sam isn't either, that it's completely unimportant or irrelevant. But it isn't sufficient. It doesn't give Russia any guarantees that the future Ukraine won't become a base for NATO forces. It doesn't address Ukraine's military capabilities. And for the Ukrainians, there have to be real questions about the credibility of U.S. security guarantees and their value, watching what's happened in the Gulf. And so the framework has to be completely different. And so we recommend an approach that's really based on trading security guarantees for security guarantees. And those would include guarantees from Ukraine to Russia and Russia to Ukraine, and from Europe and the United States to both Moscow and Kyiv. And all of these guarantees would then be conditional on adherence to a broader package. So if Russia violated it, they would lose the promises from the United States and Europe. Any guarantees the Ukraine had made would also be void. And similarly, if Ukraine violated. And this would create sort of a network of assurances that would address the core political issues at the root of the conflict, issues about NATO expansion and Ukraine's alignment and Ukraine's military capabilities, and Moscow's future military posture vis-a-vis Ukraine. And so we argue that this would set the stage for a more stable relationship between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and NATO in the long term. And it would also address like most of the core political issues at the center of the conflict. And at that point, maybe dealing with territory is a little bit easier. So, this I think is at least worth trying. It would sort of reframe and reset the negotiations with a different paradigm at its core, and might allow for more substantive progress on some of the real issues rather than continuing to beat our heads against this wall of, will Ukraine give up the rest of Donetsk or not?
Right. Well, I really recommend anybody who's listening right now to go to Foreign Affairs and check out the full article. I mean, it's more highly detailed than we would be able to get to on the show today. And congratulations for getting it published. I would be, again, remiss if I didn't ask you at the end, going back to the Iran war, do you have any predictions on what might happen with this deadline? I don't think that Iran is going to capitulate to Donald Trump, but do you have any thoughts on what might happen if they don't open the strait at the end of the day today?
I mean, with Trump, there's always the possibility that he kicks the deadline down the road. There's clear signs that he doesn't really want to escalate, even though he feels like he may have to. And so when I woke up this morning, I thought the most likely outcome would be that that there would be no deal and that the deal would get kicked down the road, that Trump would say negotiations are proceeding, that we're making progress. But after his Truth Social post this morning about like erasing a civilization, I guess I feel now like he's backed himself into a corner where he'll have to escalate. And that doesn't mean I have a high confidence that he's going to use nuclear weapons. I actually think that's unlikely. But just like I did, back on February 28th when he started this war, I feel like he's backed himself into a position where if he doesn't escalate, he looks really weak, and the credibility of his threats becomes pointless. So now I feel that he's ratcheted up the threats even more. That he'll have to do something tonight. And I don't know what that is, but it will have to be something that's more significant and more devastating to Iran than what's happened already. And, I think we should underscore before we, end our conversation that strikes on power plants and civilian infrastructure, when you've bragged about it beforehand, like these are not consistent with the laws of war. You can't, it's just not justifiable. So I do have real concerns about what might happen.
Me too. Well, thank you, Jen, for coming on the show. Always great to talk with you, and hope you'll come on again as things develop, no matter which direction they develop in.
Always happy to talk to you, Kelly, so I'd love to come back.
Thanks, Jen.